Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us for our virtual forum today, Reaching the Rising Global Middle Class. Over the next decade, more than half of the growth in global consumption is expected to come from the middle class, and by 2030, close to two-thirds of the world's population is expected to join the ranks of the global middle class. While this group shrank last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the dominance of the middle-class consumer globally is continuing to shape the e-commerce landscape for both small and large businesses. Today, we're going to take a look at the digitally savvy middle class, its expanding purchasing power, and the role leaders in the public and private sectors can play in meeting the needs of this economically powerful group. Before we get started, a couple of quick notes. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page should fix the problem in most cases. My next guest is Myron Brilliant, Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I had a chance to chat with him a short while ago about the global business landscape. Take a listen. Myron, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure. I am interested in this time we're in where so many parts of the world are trying to draw borders between themselves. I remember the days when all those borders were supposed to disappear, and exporters in the US were supposed to reach every market in the world. I'm just wondering how you feel about the geopolitical situation and where American business is today.
Well, Steve, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's always a pleasure to be on a show with you. It's been a while. Steve, this is a complex time because we're in the middle of a pandemic. We've had a great transition from one president to another, and the President Trump to President Biden. You would think, well, major shift in policies. And in fact, in the foreign policy and trade space, some continuity, right? There are differences in tone and approach and emphasis on democracy in this foreign policy being articulated by Biden administration. But there's also a lot of continuity. So we still have a lot of tariffs up. We have obviously issues around supply chains and nearshoring questions going on in this country as well as in Europe and elsewhere. We have this delicate balance between national security and commerce. We see that in the US-China space, but we also see that actually in the space between Europe and the United States. At the same time, we haven't really moved forward with any new trade agreements. We're not part of any of the major regional architectures in Asia. We're not part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're clearly not a participant in RCEP, which has got China and other countries involved. So question is where we're heading. And there's a sense of uncertainty among business leaders. Yes, we see a resurgence in our US economy. That's good. And hopefully inflation will be kept in check. But we see a resurgence in our economy. But Steve, you know this, 95% of the customers we want to sell to don't live in the United States. So we've got to figure out what our strategic framework is for doing business around the world. Government has a hand. Obviously, the United States thinks we've got innovative products to sell. We got agricultural products to sell. We have services to sell. We need to take advantage of that and create the right frameworks, the right standards, the right rulemaking. We need to hold countries like China accountable for unfair trade practices. In short, a lot of opportunity, but some uncertainty. And until we see where the administration is heading, until we see how far they can get with our allies in Europe and in Asia, until we see what the posturing is going to be with China, what's the sort of the 3 C's of competition, right, collaboration, and confrontation, how we manage the China relationship, the 2 largest economies in the world. There's a lot there. And so, I'm hopeful, but hope doesn't come without a price.
Right. And I want to give Myron, I want to give you some credit for the theme of this conference, because I think it was over a decade ago where I was at dinner with you and you said something along the line saying, understand what American business needs to know and understand and reach is where the global middle class is growing. And that global middle class, we're going to have a big middle class in Europe, we're going to have a big middle class in the US, but where it's growing in much bigger proportion to the rest of the world are places like Asia. And I'm just wondering if you still feel that strongly.
Well, I do feel strongly that Asia is a region full of dynamic economies, but I also think it's important that we not talk about words like pivot. That was a famous expression of the Obama administration. In other words, we shouldn't be pivoting to Asia. We should be engaged strategically, economically, and other ways in Asia. But let's not ignore Africa. It may not represent a large part of the world GDP, but it's home of some of the fastest economies in the world.
But it's growing fast. It's growing very quickly.
Yeah, it is growing
from
fast.
Very low base to very.
There's still a lot of areas like the rule of law, governance, and capacity growing that needs to take place, but we can't ignore it, right? China's not ignoring it. Turkey's not ignoring it. Europe is not ignoring it. So the U.S. has to have a strategy even in places like Africa. And then look at Latin America in our backyard. Here, I'm very concerned about the economies from Brazil to Mexico. Mexico's tightening up its foreign direct investment. Colombia, which is having some challenges. Brazil, certainly Argentina. We have a lot of work to do around the world to show America's leadership. I think that there's no question there is opportunity in growing middle class in areas like China, certainly in other parts of Southeast Asia. Look what's happened in Vietnam and countries like that. But for us to take advantage of those opportunities, we need a strong U.S. Leadership from the Biden administration. And there we have, a question of where the prioritization is, right? Domestic issues are very important, but they can't be the only thing on the plate of the administration.
Right. Look, I want to give the Chamber of Commerce and tell our audience you give the Chamber of Commerce an enormous amount of credit for being a leader in places like India, where with the COVID crisis there, the Chamber led in a huge pool to try to bring resources there. So you're engaged in the real issues that are out there in some of these countries. But I'm just interested in countries like India and China, which are not perfect partners. They're not perfect. Well, India is not a perfect democracy and China is not a democracy at all, I would say. But yet we've always been able in this country, and I know the Chamber has, to sort of both deal around principle and around our interests. And I'm just wondering right now, particularly when it comes to China, whether we're forgetting that we have to have that trade-off between both sides where it's not, everything or nothing.
Well, Steve, you've worked in this town a long time. It's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And so you know that there has to be nuance in our policy towards China. You can't ignore a market of 1.3 billion people. You can't ignore India either. And I appreciate your shout out for the great work that we've done, but we haven't done it alone around the pandemic response. We work with other groups like the Business Roundtable because the needs in India are so great. And we still have to worry about the Delta variant. We have to worry about whether we're going to see a rise in surges this fall in South Asia, Southeast Asia, frankly, in Latin America. So we have a role in the U.S. private sector to help. And that encourages us to put a little pressure on our own administration in terms of being involved in global vaccine diplomacy, because we can't leave it to the Russians and the Chinese. On the issue of China specifically, look, the administration is not wrong for wanting to build up its work with the allies and trying to respond to some of the issues we deal with, whether it's subsidy practices, whether it's unfair trade practices, whether it's dealing with data localization issues. And it's not wrong for wanting to have a run faster agenda in the United States, right? To build up our competitiveness here. The problem is you can't just focus on competitiveness in the United States. You can't just focus on transatlantic relations. You have to engage the Chinese. And the administration's been a little slow, in my view, even though I know a lot of people in the administration, a little slow in putting together that strategic framework around China. Where's the economic agenda there? Let's get that phase one deal fully implemented. That includes agricultural purchases, that includes areas like intellectual property. Let's move on to some of the more tricky structural issues. And I think the administration can walk and dance at the same time, meaning, even though that sounds like an oxymoron, meaning they can go talk to the Chinese about North Korea or about climate or about Iran, but they can't ignore also talking to the administration the Chinese about the economic agenda. And here, I'm very concerned because there's drift, and drift means that each country will start to adopt policies that make it more and more difficult to engage each other on healthy commerce.
I know the tweet. Yeah, I know the tweet I'm going to see is Myron brilliant to his Biden friends. A little slow, a little slow. I think you're actually right on target. But let me ask you another question. It's a little complex. Because of the pandemic, we used to kind of talk about being a digital country, a digital world, but we really weren't. We were still very much analog, and the pandemic has changed that. We've really gone online. Shopping, working, educating ourselves, all online. And I have never seen a combination of greater need about a digital presence and digital activity and a greater fragility. We just called out, the US government just called out China on, supporting potentially malicious activities in the cyberspace.
Right.
Myron, you've also been around town a lot. Given the importance of exports, given the importance of digital trade and commerce, don't you think it's time for something that the White House might convene that would pull in the Chinese and the Russians and other big stakeholders, the Europeans, in terms of digital security and raise the temperature, if you will, of trying to coordinating some protocols around that? As it seems to me, we're highly reactive, we're all concerned, but I don't see any kind of joint global coordination on that front. And I worry about it because I know that will impact US businesses in a huge way.
Well, you're absolutely right. Ransomware, cyber attacks is high on the list of priorities for corporate America, as it needs to be. Frankly, multinational companies can take care of themselves. They need the partnership with the US government. I'm worried about small and medium-sized businesses where they don't have the same firewalls and they don't have the same protections. So I do think we have to have a comprehensive response. I'm not sure I bring the Chinese and the Russians into those early conversations, Steve. Let's start with the Europeans. Let's get the Japanese, the Singaporeans, the Israelis, and others lined up around that digital security network, and then invite the Chinese and Russians in, because the Chinese and Russians are some of the sources of the challenges that we face, right? We see economic espionage, we see attacks, and the latest reference that you had to the Microsoft case is an example, perhaps state-sponsored cyber attacks. So consequently, I would work with the Europeans on this agenda and others, like-minded partners. The other part of this, though, is we don't have a digital trade agreement. We don't have a digital framework. Let's get a coalition of the willing. I've been saying this to Catherine Tai, who I'm going to speak to tomorrow about this, and others, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, about the need for a digital agenda that is both on the security and privacy side, but also on the trade side. Here we have a huge opportunity. This is a strength of our economy. And you're right, so much good has come out of the digital transformation because of the pandemic. A lot of bad things, but one thing that's good is the acceleration of the digital transformation of our society. We have a competitive edge. We need to push it by ensuring high standards that other countries abide by. So yes, let's focus on the security side, but also push forward a trade agenda. And here I think we might get some traction. This is something that I think the administration will take a look at.
Let me just real quick and finally, Myron, you've raised a couple of issues, digital, various digital deals, trade deals. This is about rulemaking, and the United States used to be a real leader in this. Do you have any sense that we are going to get back into that position? When I think about TPP, I don't think it looks promising. When I think about other rules-based bodies, is America, you would know better than I do, is America back in the game, or are we tentative about trying to shape the rules for the next, generation, if you will?
Steve, we don't have a choice. We have to be at the game. The question is, are we at the table or are we running the table, right? Where are we at that table? So I think we have to be at the game. And I think we really need to be a little bit more aggressive than we are. Certainly, this will be part of the EU-US Technology Council that was announced during President Biden's trip to Europe. But there's more than that, right? So I think, yes, we need to be at the table. Yes, we need to be leading it, because otherwise there's going to be other countries leading that effort. Europe has already adopted standards that much of the world follows, and they're not consistent with US standards. And China is beginning to adopt its own standards. So the United States should assert itself in this regard. This is big time issue for technology companies, for banks, for Main Street businesses. So I would hope that we don't sit on this opportunity, that we seize it and we show real leadership. But I think broadly defined here, Steve, I think America has this opportunity. I think there's a window here right now for this administration. And I know how much focus we have to place on infrastructure and other big issues here at home, but you can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we cannot ignore, and I know the administration would say we're not ignoring, but what I mean is start creating those strategic frameworks, those dialogues, whether it's with the Chinese, the Europeans, and others, to show we're back formulating a policy that will advance America's interests worldwide, but not to do it alone, do it in partnership.
It is always great to have a conversation like this with Myron Brilliant, Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Myron, thank you so much.
Steve, and thank you for not wearing a tie today. A pleasure to be with you.
Anytime.